In my first life, I thought I had everything: a glittering engagement to Adrian Cross, the man every magazine called the city's golden bachelor, a penthouse overlooking the skyline, and the kind of best friend people envied me for, Harper, who knew every corner of my soul and stood at my side as if she were my shadow. But beneath that polished facade was a nightmare I didn't see until it was too late, for Adrian never loved me. He only loved what I carried, the shares in my late father's empire. The inheritance I was too naive to protect, and Harper, the girl I trusted like a sister, wasn't loyal at all, for when I uncovered their affair it was not in whispers or rumors but in the brutal intimacy of finding them together in Adrian's office, his tie loosened, her lipstick smeared across his jaw, their laughter cut short when they saw me standing in the doorway, and though I staggered away with my heart in my throat, the true cruelty came after, when Adrian cornered me in the garage and told me flatly that I was useful only until the documents were signed, that Harper was what he wanted and I was merely the vessel of his rise, and before I could scream, before I could run, the world shattered as the car lurched forward, the headlights blinding me, the sound of metal and bone colliding as I was thrown into the pavement, my body crumpled under the weight of betrayal, my last breath filling with the scent of gasoline and his cologne, and in that moment of breaking, I thought it was over. But instead I awoke choking in my own bed years earlier, my hands clutching sheets I hadn't owned in years, the engagement ring not yet on my finger, Adrian not yet mine, Harper not yet my betrayer, and the city outside my window alive with the hum of a life I thought I'd lost, and I laughed, first in disbelief, then in rage, for fate had dragged me back, and this time I would not waste my second life weeping. I would not hand over my fortune to liars, I would not be killed like prey. I would sharpen myself into a blade, and if Adrian thought he could trap me again, if Harper thought she could wear my skin, then I would show them how dangerous I could be, for I would not fight alone, not this time, and already one name seared itself into my mind, Damian Hale, the cold billionaire with a reputation blacker than any rumor, a man who destroyed rivals for sport and built empires from ashes, the kind of man my father once called dangerous, the kind Adrian once mocked as ruthless. The man who never looked twice at me in my first life, but who this time would, because I would make sure of it, and with his shadow over me, Adrian and Harper would choke on the ruin I laid at their feet. The first days of my second life were a study in restraint, because every instinct in me screamed to confront Adrian, to spit the truth into Harper's painted smile, to rip apart the fragile illusions they had spun around me, but vengeance was a dish that had to be served slowly, meticulously, and I understood now that the most lethal strikes are never made in fury but in silence, so I played my part perfectly, answering Adrian's calls with breathless excitement, allowing Harper to loop her arm through mine as she gushed about dress fittings, all the while cataloging every glance they exchanged, every lie they believed hidden, and in the nights when the city lights poured through my windows, I sat awake remembering the moment of my death, the sound of the engine revving, the brutal shock of betrayal, and I whispered to myself that this time I would not stumble blindly into their trap, I would build my own, brick by brick, until the walls closed in on them. But even as my fury grew, another thought threaded itself through my mind like a dangerous melody: Damian Hale, the untouchable billionaire who ruled the business world like an emperor, whose name alone silenced rooms, who I remembered only in headlines and rare glimpses, his gray eyes as cold as steel, his reputation soaked in fear, a man who thrived on leverage and never forgave weakness, and in my past life I had been too timid to ever cross into his orbit, too busy clutching at Adrian's counterfeit affection, but now, in this reborn life, I knew Damian was exactly what I needed, because if Adrian was the kind of man who built his power on lies, Damian was the kind who razed liars to the ground and salted the earth where they fell. Yet I couldn't simply walk into his office and beg, because men like Damian didn't give, they took. And if I wanted him to see me as more than another spoiled heiress, I had to become something sharper, something dangerous, so I began where I could, scouring through my father's old files, memorizing deals, investors, names, tracing every string that Adrian once planned to use against me, and every time I uncovered another thread of betrayal my resolve hardened, and when whispers reached me that Damian himself would attend a charity gala hosted at the Cross family estate, the very same place where Adrian had once paraded me as his prize, I knew fate was offering me the opening I needed, and this time I would not stand in Adrian's shadow, this time I would step into Damian Hale's. The gala gleamed like a jewel box cracked open, chandeliers scattering light across sequined gowns and polished marble, the air thick with champagne and false laughter, but I barely felt the weight of the diamond choker at my throat because all of me was straining for the moment Damien Hale would appear, and when he did, the room shifted as if pulled into his orbit, conversations faltering, eyes tracking the man in the tailored black suit whose very presence seemed carved from shadow and firelight, and though Adrian basked in attention like a peacock, it was Damien who silenced the hall without a word, his gaze sweeping the crowd with cool disinterest until it landed briefly on me, a flicker that jolted through my spine, but before I could draw a breath Harper's arm looped through mine, her voice saccharine as she whispered, "Don't stare, Elle, men like him don't look twice at women like us," and I almost laughed aloud at the irony, because I knew what Harper did not, that I was no longer the fragile girl she could push from a throne, I was a blade waiting to cut, and as I let her drag me forward to where Adrian stood preening with a group of donors, I caught sight of Damien again, speaking to no one, his aura so commanding that even the boldest executives kept their distance, and something inside me shifted, because in my first life I would have looked away, but tonight I stepped closer, my heels tapping against the marble until I was near enough for the cologne of smoke and cedar to coil around me, and though his eyes flicked down with the barest hint of impatience, I did not falter. I tilted my chin and said evenly, "Mr. Hale, I think you and I might be of use to one another," and for a breathless second the world hung still, Harper's grip tightening on my arm, Adrian's laugh echoing across the room, and Damien's grey eyes cutting through me like a blade as he murmured bold words for a woman wearing another man's ring, his tone both mocking and intrigued, and I knew in that instant that he saw straight through me, that whatever mask I wore, Damien Hale had already caught the scent of the fire beneath it. For a long moment Damien said nothing more, only studied me with that unblinking stare that seemed to strip away every layer of pretense, and I forced myself to hold his gaze though my pulse hammered against my ribs, because I knew if I flinched now he would dismiss me as easily as brushing lint from his sleeve, and finally, with a faint curve of his lips that wasn't quite a smile, he murmured, "If you have something worth my time, say it. If not, don't waste my evening," his voice low, flat, threaded with a disinterest that made lesser men crumble, and Harper gave a nervous laugh, tugging at my arm as though to drag me away before I embarrassed myself, but I twisted free and stepped closer, my voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through the din of the gala. "You pride yourself on breaking liars, Mr. Hale. What if I told you I know two of them plotting right under your nose?" And though his expression didn't shift, I saw the faintest glint in his eyes, the flicker of a predator catching the scent of prey, and he tilted his head just slightly, saying, "Names," in that same detached tone, but I shook my head, refusing to give without securing my place. "Not here, not yet, prove to me you want to hear them," and for the first time, silence stretched between us heavy enough to press the air from my lungs, until Damien leaned in, his breath grazing my ear as he murmured, "If you're lying, I'll bury you so deep not even your fortune will remember your name," and the threat should have terrified me, but instead it lit something wild in my chest, because I could feel Harper's confusion burning beside me, Adrian's laughter carrying across the room, and Damien's presence coiling around me like smoke and steel, and I realized that I had already set myself apart from the woman I once was, because this time I wasn't waiting to be destroyed, I was daring the devil himself to test me. The rest of the night blurred in a haze of champagne and forced laughter, Adrian basking in the glow of donors while Harper fluttered at his side like the perfect accessory, her eyes darting toward me now and then as though she sensed something slipping beyond her grasp, but I smiled sweetly, played my role flawlessly, and beneath it all I carried the echo of Damien's words like a brand seared into my skin, his promise to bury me if I proved false and the dark thrill that surged through me at knowing I had his attention, and when the gala ended I excused myself from Adrian's insistent hand, claiming fatigue, slipping away into the cold night where the city lights shimmered like scattered jewels across the black, and that was where I found it, an unmarked envelope tucked into the seat of the car waiting for me, no seal, no flourish, only 3 words written in an austere hand, Pier 19. Midnight. My breath caught, my body thrumming with adrenaline, because I knew immediately who it was from, and though every instinct warned me that walking into his world meant stepping into a labyrinth with no exit, I felt no fear, only a hunger I couldn't disguise anymore, and so hours later, cloaked in shadows and silk, I stood on the pier with the ocean wind tangling my hair, and when Damien emerged from the darkness he was not the polished figure of the gala but something sharper, dressed in black. His presence colder, his eyes assessing as they landed on me like I was both puzzle and challenge, and he said nothing at first, only studied me until I thought the silence might tear me apart, before finally murmuring, "You came," and I forced my voice steady as I replied, "You asked," and the corner of his mouth twitched as though he found the answer acceptable. Then he extended a folder toward me, thick and heavy, Adrian Cross. Harper Vale. I assume those are your liars, and when I opened it under the dim pier light, my breath froze, for inside were photographs, transactions, conversations I hadn't yet lived in this second life but Damien had already uncovered, proof that their betrayal was not only inevitable but already set in motion, and my heart pounded with something far more dangerous than fear. Because in that moment I realized Damien Hale was not just the ally I sought, he was the executioner I had summoned, and together we would make Adrian and Harper choke on the empire they thought they could steal. I traced each photograph with shaking fingers, Harper's hand resting on Adrian's arm in a cafe far from the eyes of society, Adrian's signature scrawled across secret transfers that siphoned from accounts my father had once built, the kind of evidence that would have gutted me in my first life but now only fueled the furnace roaring in my chest, and when I looked up Damien was watching me, not with pity nor with the smugness of someone revealing a sordid affair, but with a kind of cold patience, as though he was waiting to see whether I would crumble or sharpen, and I forced myself to meet his gaze as I asked, "Why show me this, why not use it yourself?" And he leaned against the pier railing, the shadows clinging to him like armor as he replied, "Because I wanted to see if you were worth the trouble, Celine," using my name with a precision that felt both intimate and threatening. "Most women in your position run to lawyers or fathers or lovers. I wanted to see if you would run to me," and I hated that my breath caught, hated the way my body betrayed me with heat coiling low as he spoke, because he wasn't offering comfort or protection, he was offering fire, and something in me wanted to burn, so I closed the folder with steady hands and said, "Then don't waste either of our time. Tell me what you want from me," and for a long moment he was silent, the wind snapping between us, until he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the dark spice of his cologne, close enough that my heart stumbled against my ribs, and he said softly, "Loyalty. Obedience. Nerve. Give me that, and I'll give you Adrian's head on a platter," and though his words were a dare wrapped in steel, I felt my lips curve in something perilously close to a smile as I whispered back, "Then teach me how to kill him without ever lifting a blade," and the glint in Damien's eyes told me that was exactly the answer he had been waiting for. From that night, everything shifted, the air between Damien and me taut like a wire ready to snap, and while the city still saw me as Adrian's perfect fiancé, every step I took was guided by the quiet instructions Damien slid into my hands, each one designed to tighten the noose around Adrian and Harper without them realizing it, and at first it was small. Delivering a message to the right board member at the right time, planting a seed of doubt in an investor's ear at a luncheon, but each move was a thread in a larger web Damien was weaving with ruthless precision, and though I never asked how far his reach extended, I saw it in the way doors opened for me, in the way men twice my age began to regard me not as a naive heiress but as someone to be feared, and yet, in the shadows of all this control, my body betrayed me, because every meeting with Damien left me burning, every brush of his hand as he handed me another folder or straightened a page was enough to leave my pulse racing, and I hated myself for craving it, for craving him, even as I reminded myself he was not a man who gave freely. But when one evening I stumbled in his office, exhausted from another staged dinner with Adrian, my heels discarded by the door, Damien poured me a glass of whiskey and pressed it into my hand with fingers brushing mine, lingering a moment too long. And in the heavy silence that followed, I felt the question rise between us unspoken, whether this alliance was still only about vengeance or if it had already transformed into something far more dangerous, and though he said nothing, the way his gaze lingered on my lips before he turned away told me he was fighting the same fire I was, and I realized then that destroying Adrian and Harper might not be the only thing that consumed me in this second life. Adrian began to notice the change in me before Harper did, his polished charm faltering whenever my laughter came too sharp or my gaze lingered too long on business matters I had once pretended not to understand, and one night after a gala he cornered me in the back of the car, his hand gripping my thigh with a little too much force as he murmured, "You've been different lately, sweetheart, colder, sharper. Who's teaching you to look at me like that?" And though every instinct told me to recoil, I only tilted my head and smiled, replying sweetly, Maybe I'm just learning who you really are, watching the flicker of unease cross his eyes before he smothered it with another smirk. But that moment told me he was already suspicious, and suspicion in Adrian was deadly because I knew how far he would go when cornered. And when I told Damien about it later, pacing his office in agitation, he simply said, "Good. Let him smell the trap." Panic makes men sloppy, his tone calm as ever, though the flash of steel in his gaze when I mentioned Adrian's hand on me did something wicked to my chest, and then he stood, closing the distance between us in slow measured steps until he was close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, and he murmured, "But if he ever lays a finger on you again, Celine, he won't live to regret it," his voice low, dangerous, and something inside me twisted at the way his words were both threat and promise, and though the room was silent but for the thundering of my pulse, neither of us moved, suspended in a tension thick enough to choke, until Damien finally brushed past me, his shoulder grazing mine, leaving me trembling in the aftershock of a moment that was not a kiss but felt like one, and I realized with shuddering clarity that Adrian's destruction would not be the only fire I fed in this life. It was Harper who started to crack first, her vanity always weaker than Adrian's composure, for she began showing up at my penthouse unannounced with gifts and excuses, her smile too bright, her perfume cloying as she tried to press herself into my routines, and one evening she perched on my sofa with a glass of wine, tilting her head as she said sweetly, "You've been spending so much time alone lately, Elle. You know you can always tell me anything, right?" Her eyes sharp despite the honey in her voice, but I only laughed lightly, curling closer into my silk robe as though I hadn't already seen the photos of her with Adrian tucked in Damien's folder, and I said, "Of course, Harper, but some things are better kept between a woman and herself." Watching her mask flicker with frustration she quickly disguised as concern, and later, when I met Damien in the low hum of his private office, I relayed every word and saw the faintest shadow of amusement cross his features as he murmured, "She's testing your defenses, good, let her think she's clever. The more she presses, the more careless she'll become," and then, almost without thought, he reached forward to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his touch lingering for a fraction longer than necessary, and my breath caught because this man who threatened to bury me was now brushing my skin as if it belonged to him, and though he pulled back before I could react, the silence between us throbbed with something unsaid, the weight of desire curling beneath the ruthlessness, and I understood then that our alliance had already become more intimate than either of us had planned, because every whispered strategy, every stolen glance, every subtle touch was fusing into something neither of us could name without undoing the careful restraint we still clung to, and as I left that night, the city lights reflecting in the glass towers around me, I swore that when Harper finally fell, it would not only be my victory, it would be Damien's too, and perhaps that was what terrified me most of all. The end came not with a whisper but with a storm, a crescendo of all the threads Damien and I had pulled until they snapped around Adrian and Harper's throats, choking them on their own arrogance, and it began with the leaked contracts, the proof of Adrian's embezzlement sliding across boardroom tables, his name blacklisted overnight, investors clawing back funds as his empire bled out faster than he could patch it, and while he scrambled to keep the mask of the golden fiancé intact, Harper's carefully spun lies about my fragility unraveled in public when the press uncovered photographs of her slipping into Adrian's apartment at hours that betrayed their affair, the headlines slicing through her image like razors, and suddenly the woman who had once been painted as my sister in everything but blood was now dragged across front pages as a thief, a betrayer, a mistress. Her crocodile smile splashed in shame while her phone stopped ringing, her friends scattering like rats from a sinking ship. But the most exquisite part of it all was watching them turn on each other, Adrian snarling at her in public, Harper weeping to me in private with the audacity to beg for help, her hands clutching mine as though I had not once seen those same fingers tangled in his tie, and I only leaned close enough for her to hear the truth dripping from my lips. "You didn't just steal him, Harper, you stole my life, and now I'm taking yours back," before leaving her sobbing in the foyer of a hotel she could no longer afford to stay in. And when Adrian finally came to me, his suit rumpled, his eyes hollow, his voice raw as he rasped, "You're all I have left, Celine, please, help me, I'll fix everything," I looked at him the way he had once looked at me when I lay broken on the pavement, and I said with a smile that felt like fire, "You never had me, Adrian, you only ever had what was mine, and now even that is gone." And I watched the fury twist his face, the reality sink into his bones as Damien's men arrived to escort him out, not as a fiancé, not as a golden bachelor, but as a ruined man with nothing left but his rage. And when the noise of his protests faded, I turned to Damien, who stood in the shadows of the penthouse like the architect of my rebirth, his gray eyes steady, his presence consuming, and for the first time there was no threat in his words, only possession as he murmured, "It's done, Celine. You're free." And the fire that had been simmering between us for months finally broke its chains when I stepped into his orbit, my hands curling into his jacket as his mouth claimed mine, the kiss sharp, consuming, everything he had denied and everything I had craved. And in that moment I knew he had not just given me vengeance, he had given me a new life. One where I was no longer the naive girl waiting to be destroyed but the woman who stood crowned in the ruins of her enemies. And as Damien's arms closed around me, the city glittering below like a kingdom at our feet, I understood that rebirth was never about survival, it was about transformation, and together we were unstoppable, the queen and the wolf, bound by fire, hunger, and the empire we would claim from the ashes of those who had dared to betray me.